Hi, Heart of Healthcare listeners. I'm John Bricalia, CEO and co-founder of Marvin Behavioral Health. Marvin provides mental health care for physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, partnering with hospitals to build the mental health care system clinicians deserve. Designed by clinicians for clinicians. If you're passionate about supporting the people who care for everyone else or know a clinician in need, we'd love to connect with you. See more at meetmarvin.com and come join us.
Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Hallie Tecco.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Krause. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
So buckle up and join us as we figure out how to improve healthcare for all. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. Steve and I are excited to welcome you to July. We are halfway through of this year, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It has been a year. I think we should get right into this. We've got a lot of headlines that are mostly not political.
Yeah, not a lot of politics, even though what's going on in the world. We're going to stick to healthcare here.
Try to stay in our lane.
Right.
Well, I'll kick us off. Dare I say digital health is back?
I love those words.
It has been a very good few months for digital health startups and investors. Not only did we have two IPOs, Hinge and Omada, which both of us were involved in one of those, but
congrats.
So exciting. Yeah, congrats. There have also been some really interesting later stage funding rounds that are announced, including a bridge, which raised $300 million for the AI note-taking tool for clinicians. That is one of your deals, so congrats. Commure, which raised $200 million for AI-driven provider software. And we are going to have the Commure CEO on the show soon. We had Nabla, which raised $70 million, also for AI note-taking, and Sword Health, which raised kind of a top-up round of $40 million and announced it was expanding into mental health. The big commonality of all of these companies is obviously AI. Steve, there is so much money pouring into the AI for clinicians, AI for providers space. Do you think that there's going to be consolidation, or do you think there's still room for more folks to build in this space?
Well, first of all, as a longtime traveler and a journey person in the space as you are, Hallie, it's really nice to finally see some good IPOs. I always said, you've been doing this for 15 years, so have I, roughly. And, the first 5 to 7 years, I'd be sit on panels, and I'm sure you would, because you were like one of the main OGs in the space and thought leaders. And people would be like, where are the IPOs? And you'd have to say, oh my God, whoa, take a step back. This is a very nascent industry. You got to start the company's got to grow, and then ultimately get public. Yeah. And frankly, as we talked about before, the first crop of IPOs happened to be probably some of the companies went out too early, but it also happened to be with like the Great Recession, right, and the crash. And so it killed our industry. And I was worried that it had a little bit of a scarlet letter on it, but it's nice to see Hinge perform really well in the public markets. It's nice to see Omada get out. We all love Sean Duffy.
It's stabilized.
Yeah, it's doing fine, and a huge market opportunity. And then, this AI moment in healthcare is real. And so to your question, I actually think there's a ton of room to run. I mean, and the reason I say that is, prior to this AI moment, my colleague Sophia Guerra and I did this analysis where if you market map the spend in healthcare, roughly 90% was on clinical services, broadly defined, more service-based companies, and like 10% was based on technology spend. And I think what AI has done, because we all know AI, one of the powers of it and one of the potential challenges of it is that it turns services into software in many industries, not just healthcare, but healthcare is the most service laborious industry laden with opportunity. And so that 90% of the market map of the total spend, which wasn't addressable before with technology businesses, which as we know have better unit economics, frankly have often better retention, higher gross margins, that wasn't available for healthcare venture-backed companies and entrepreneurs to attack. And now, not all of it, but a good portion of it is available to attack. And I think that makes ACVs larger, contract values larger, so that you only have 6,000 health systems out there in America, and you have, name on your hand, probably 60, 100 insurance plans, right? And so frankly, being able to, not a lot of accounts to go out and sell to, right, as customers, but if the ACVs are a lot larger, which we know healthcare is a huge industry, now I think it's ripe for opportunity. So yeah, a lot of money, a lot of venture-backed money, a lot of entrepreneurs have already been focusing on AI, and right now it's often in the back office or some of those areas, but I think that area is still ripe to be attacked. We identified in a report, we did 60 jobs to be done, unique jobs to be done, of which note-taking is just one, right? Of RCM is, there's lots of stages of RCM, but it's only one category. There's a lot more categories. So I'm very optimistic. I don't think it's going to be time for consolidation. I think that might be 5 to 10 years from now. Yeah. I think there's just a lot more opportunity for entrepreneurs to attack. Super exciting.
All right, founders, listen up. Go pitch Steve your AI and healthcare idea.
Please.
He is bullish. So Steve, the other through line are the mega funds that are leading these growth rounds. Both are kind of the straddle tech and healthcare, General Catalyst, which backs Sword and Commure, and of course Andreessen, which led a Bridges round. What do you make of their late stage strategies in healthcare right now?
I think it's actually one of the things I want to talk about. So it sort of segues into the sort of story that I wanted to focus on, which is there this new way to build a health tech unicorn? And frankly, the organization you founded, Rock Health, put out a report we could put in the show notes this past month where they sort of detailed a retrospective kind of unicorn analysis of, they analyzed 70 digital health unicorns, by the way, which all of those companies that you named would meet the bar. And they found, the insights were probably pretty obvious, but it was interesting to see the data. Unicorns secure funding early, right? Commure, Sword, Bridge, classic examples. They're often valued on more like SaaS companies than on, traditional healthcare service companies. And so, I think the interesting thing that I wondered about those different strategies, I also think, at least at Bessemer, we found, we often like to double down on our companies, but it's also been interesting to see outside-led rounds versus inside-led rounds. I'm not saying there's a better way, right? Clearly, GC is bullish about Sword. They're clearly bullish about Commure. But I do think sometimes it's interesting to see an outside round like a Bridges continue to raise outside rounds. But I think the more interesting question is to compare the Commure GC strategy, which really is about aggregating assets, like kind of a private to private acquisitions, right? Commure acquired, they started off, they ultimately acquired Augmetics, they've acquired Memora Health, they acquired Patient Keeper, I believe. So that is a venture-backed roll-up strategy, which I think we're going to see more private to private acquisitions, especially in over time, as we just talked about. But I'm curious to see whether these venture-backed kind of roll-up strategies are equally successful or more successful or less successful than the private equity-backed roll-up strategies, right? So our portfolio company, Smarter DX, just sold to New Mountain Capital, where they're aggregating, RCM assets. So it's probably might be competitive with Commure. It might be a good A/B test, but New Mountain is a traditional private equity firm that has experience rolling up companies, finding synergies, right? Understanding how to balance growth with actually getting to profitability. Traditionally, venture capitalists haven't done that well. I was actually trying to think, I can't think of a venture-backed private-to-private acquisition that has worked. Maybe one, but I'm curious, that's the question. Is this the new strategy? To your earlier question to me is rolling up these companies the right strategy, and is venture capital the right form to do that? I'd love your thoughts, actually.
I mean, some of these funds just have so much money now. It feels like they have to put it to work in some way. And if you look at the most successful exits in digital health, a good number of them, a shocking number of them, have been orchestrated by PE and are these PE roll-ups. And so I think probably some smart people with a lot of money at these funds look around and say, well, what do we do? What strategy should we take? And, kind of thinking about the PE strategy. On paper, it makes sense. But as you said, are they going to be good at it? I don't know the teams behind it. Maybe they hired folks from PE experience to actually, orchestrate, all the nuances of it. But I think when you raise that big of a fund, you have to think differently, because that's it's a new way.
The capital.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And in terms of going back to the Rock Health article, one of the takeaways was that unicorns raise more money faster. And I kind of laughed at that. It's Yeah, that's how they become unicorns. That's the definition of unicorns.
Right.
But as you said, I think
it's like
it was
a circular
interesting.
reference.
Yeah, I was like, okay. But I did think it was interesting, the multiples, because I actually haven't seen a lot of data on that because these are private companies. These tend not to be disclosed multiples when they raise. It's interesting to see that they actually closely mirror the SaaS companies. I'm actually working on an interesting project right now looking at the gross margins of tech-enabled digital health companies, specifically tech-enabled services companies like Omada, like Hinge, and where they kind of fall. Because as you know, like software companies have beautiful 80% plus margins. We know healthcare companies, traditional healthcare services companies have extremely low, sub 20% margins. So like, where are these digital health tech-enabled companies falling on that map? And so far, we're actually seeing that they're able to get gross margins that look more like tech companies, some of them even exceeding it. If you look at like Hims has exceptional gross margins that are really impressive. And so I think that in terms of the multiples meeting that, having that other additional data point is really interesting. I just wonder how much of the multiple data was skewed by the crazy multiples of the ZERP era, because there's also just longitudinal trends. And we know that the multiples right now are far lower than what they were 4 years ago.
No, 100%. You can see that in the companies that are going public and what their, Series DE investors paid versus what they're trading at in public companies. And generally you see a decrease in sort of multiple as the company's growth slows. But I do think, I've always said I love doing venture. I actually personally love doing early stage, even though Bessemer's a large fund. I try to go early and it's just the most fun part, working with teams. But I would say I think growth equity, more so even than private equity, I think growth equity is like the sweet spot for healthcare, which is maybe why GC, to your point, is creating new strategies, which I give them credit for. Like they funded Commure in a very interesting way. It was more like a debt-like feature where they were basically giving Commure money and forward funding sales and marketing spend, and then would get return on the actual sort of ROI of that sales and marketing spend. If it didn't return, they would take a loss. So it was more of a debt-like feature. They actually didn't get equity ownership in Commure. So I give them credit for thinking about new strategies, to your point. But I have to say, I think the data shows that growth equity, our companies, you back so many founders over your career. I backed founders. It's really hard to do early stage healthcare. And even if it's IT, it's just like to land those first customers, the sales cycles, all of the regulation, right? And so, but ultimately when our companies get to scale, they're actually really interesting businesses, right? When they get to $50, $100 million of revenue, they have even if they're services companies, they might have lower gross margins, but they can really print cash, which is why growth equity and private equity has liked the space so much over, decades, right? So maybe you're right. Maybe VCs are saying, hey, or some VCs are saying, hey, maybe we should get more into that game, and because they're maybe looking at the returns. I'd like to get more into that game. It's also just like shorter time to ROI. Yeah. It's like less risky, shorter time. So all right. Well, it's the Techo Growth Equity Healthcare Funds coming up next, huh? I like it. So, all right. Well, speaking of startups that have great gross margins, I'm going to aptly name this story Novo Giveth, Novo Taketh Away, because Novo Nordisk ended its partnership with Hims to distribute Wegovy through Hims's direct-to-consumer platform. They did not do this quietly. They literally put out a press release, which I will include in the show notes, saying that Hims is quote-unquote disseminating deceptive marketing that puts patient safety at risk. They are upset that Hims is still compounding GLPs, and that they refer to compounded GLPs as knockoffs that contain foreign illicit ingredients. I hadn't heard compounded GLPs called knockoffs before. I like that they're positioning it like that. It's pretty funny. But also kind of fear-mongering with the foreign ingredients that are obviously under less scrutiny than a typical FDA-approved drug. So the Hims CEO, Andrew Dudum, who's really a phenomenal CEO, has done a phenomenal job with that company. He pushed back, saying that Novo tried to strong-arm providers, limit patient choice, and argued that their personalized dosing still qualifies under the compounding rules, which are, I believe it's like if it's within 15 to 20% of the dosage, or if you add an ingredient to it that makes it different enough, you can still compound. Regardless, Hims shares dropped 32% following the Novo announcement. What a wild year for Hims, by the way. I mean, it's like I feel like we talk about this company maybe every other digital health download, and
more than any other company,
right? More than any, which is cool, by the way. It's that is cool. I got to say that's cool. Again, as us having been in this industry a long time, like I used to say, I said it like DTC is DOA. I think you've even quoted me on that, like dead on arrival, and I was wrong, right? And Hims is like we need, our North Stars at Bessemer for the 15 years I've been investing is the digitization of the industry, the kind of valuetization, like value-based care movement in the industry, and then the consumerization. And frankly, I actually think we've done really well in digitization. We've done pretty well in valuetization. You can poke holes, at least in primary care. Like there's some real companies out there. Like the consumerization, we suck as an industry for the most part. But kudos to Andrew and to Hims. Like they've been the one, I'm sure there are a few other companies we could mention, but they've been the one that have really like plowed forward on this. But like think about being a public shareholder in this company. I mean, it went from a low, I think, of $21.56 to a high of $68.74. Now down, as you said, to $45. And by the way, massive perturbations in there. Like, so wild. I don't know what I think about this. I think this is like, we've talked about compounding. We've talked about the issues of compounding. And I can't speak for Hims. I'm not involved. My guess is that team does it the right way. I think this is an example of regulatory capture where the large incumbents don't like compounding, and there were loopholes used for sure because of the shortage, which by the way was, as we talked about before, that's those manufacturers' fault. Like in the one hand, these GLP-1s have been amazing. Who expected the success of them? But on the other hand, like we said, if you're the supply chain management person in charge of these things and you ran out of supply, like that was billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars that you lost, and Hims sort of filled the void. But of course, regulatory capture, all of a sudden that's reversed, and now Hims is taking a toll for that. So, but yet again, you see these Novos and the Lillys, they're all doing their own direct things as well. So they're probably now thinking, wow, Hims is a real competitor and we want to squash them. So it's crazy. It's wild.
Yeah.
I kind of hope the small guy wins. I'm generally like a David versus Goliath, like David guy, as long as they're doing it the right way. But man, wow, what a ride.
What a ride.
All right. Our next story, speaking of drugs, this was a really fascinating article I read. And by the way, it fits a little bit with my experience. Anyways, we'll post in the show notes. The article was in Bloomberg, and it was titled, Cancer Drugs Cost More Than Ever, and They Often Don't Extend Lives. And Bloomberg team, it was long. It was an expose, very, very long, worth a read. They basically looked and they sort of, again, speaking of regulatory capture, they really showed how so much money has been made over by, oncology-focused companies taking advantage of changes that the FDA put forth over the last 2 decades for the right reasons, to speed up the approval of oncology drugs that ultimately treat patients and who need it, right? Prodded on by the companies themselves, also by obviously patient advocacy groups to speed up approvals and to get more drugs in the hands of oncologists and patients. But they found that despite those drugs yielding more than $50 billion for the drug makers themselves over the past decade, very few of them have actually demonstrated survival benefit. And it's a really interesting story because the question is, I mean, I had a mother who had pancreatic cancer and she really wanted to fight, right? She wanted to survive, and that's a deadly disease. She was stage 4 and she lived only like 4 months. But as her son, I was like, yeah, sure, Mom, if you want to fight, let's do it. Let's, take some of these oncology drugs. And honestly, it was a wrong decision in retrospect because the quality of life which this article talks about wasn't great. And I know a lot about drug development because I invested in biotech companies in the first part of my career. And I was just always fascinated by how the measure for approval now is this thing called progression-free survival, which means that the size of the tumor decreases by 20%. That is one of the accelerated approval benchmarks that are used. But then drug makers don't even need to prove that it actually lengthens survival. Yeah. And so the article sort of says that, frankly, a lot of drugs are out there. Patients have a lot of hope, and then they realize that it's not actually leading to them living longer. And frankly, it's not. Yeah. And then there's lots of side effects. And of course, they cost money in terms of copays and patient payment parts. So that's the negative side of the article. The American Cancer Society will say that U.S. cancer deaths have plummeted 34% since peaking in 1991. But this is just really fascinating. I'm curious, did you read it? I hope you read it because I sent it to you, and it's really good. And I'd love your thoughts because you're a big patient advocate as well. Yeah. So what did you think?
So, it sounds like these drugs, I wasn't unaware of this, but they're getting approved more quickly based on the tumor shrinkage, as you said, before having real solid survival data. And I think the question is that the balance we want? Faster innovation and faster access, but lower standard of evidence. And it sounds like that's the trade-off we've made. But then what happens once the drug is out there? And are we able to be more transparent? Because we're obviously making progress in cancer treatment. You're better off getting cancer today than any other time in history. So to me, the problem is, well, beyond the price tag, the problem is that lack of transparency in outcomes and really understanding the cost benefit of one drug versus another in terms of survival as we get more real world data since drugs are getting approved earlier. But is that, who made that call on wanted faster innovation?
Well, it was because of patient lobbying in the 2000s when, frankly, the FDA had been slow to approve HIV drugs. And so patient advocacy groups sort of talked about this accelerated approval process. And the oncology companies, which, by the way, oncology is like the largest, even though we talk about GLP-1s, the oncology profits and sales are like massively more than the GLP-1. So these are huge franchises for almost every drug company. Frankly, what the FDA said is, okay, we're going to create these accelerated approval benchmarks and timelines. But in return, there was a fee, which basically makes up half of the FDA's budget, which is paid for by pharma companies as a user fee. And honestly, the pharma companies are the ones who kind of, run the trials. And so once a drug's approved, there's a question around, is there an incentive for the pharma companies to do exactly as you said, which is to track long-term data? And my guess is for the drugs that really work, they will do it. And for the drugs that might not work in terms of survival, they might not. And so it was a really interesting article about regulatory capture in our country. And we talked about quality of life year adjusted, right? And I don't know. I mean, I think there has to be it's a large area of spend, and I think there has to be some regulatory oversight in this area. And my worry is that if the companies don't do as you're saying, which is track long-term data and be transparent about it, it's going to be, we know what happens. It's going to be heavy-handed.
Yeah.
The government's going to come down and change it.
Someone has to be working on this. This feels like a really great digital health solution, right? Understanding that cost benefit, giving providers and patients an understanding of the cost benefit of various treatment options.
Yeah. Right? That should be happening. I'm sure it is happening. I don't know who pays for it will be the question. Maybe the payers, right? So we'll see. And this new administration under Robert Kennedy, he's not a huge fan of the drug companies. So it's going to be interesting to see whether this article and probably follow-on articles create some questions around the drug companies and what they need to do from a regulatory approval process.
Supplements, though.
Supplements.
He likes those supplements.
He likes suntanning, too.
All right. Well, my next story
Speaking of regulations.
I guess we are getting a little political. Oregon just passed one of the most aggressive anti-private equity healthcare bills in the country. The governor signed Bill 951 into law earlier this month, and it goes hard on restricting how private equity can operate in the state. We actually talked last year about what happened when Optum bought one of the providers there. But it's specifically cracking down on the management service organizations, the MSOs, that startups and PE firms, they generally use those to run the clinical practices. And so the new law says that MSOs can't own a majority stake. They can't sit on boards. They can't influence clinical operations like hiring, compensation, scheduling, payer contracts. And it also bans, I like this part, it bans non-compete and non-disparagement clauses between MSOs and clinicians. And it also gives the state the power to kill any deals that violate the law or that they perceive to be violating the intent of this law. What do you make of this? Is this a harbinger for what's to come in PE and healthcare, or is this just Oregon being Oregon?
Well, Oregon is a very progressive state, has always been when it comes to healthcare. So, but I don't like this. I'm trying to take out my investor hat on and put my sort of public health policy hat on. Listen, there have been plenty of stories of investor-backed, PE-backed, even venture-backed. We cited one healthcare company is not doing the right thing. But I'm generally an optimist. Even the PE companies, which are ultimately their main job is on profit and profit growth, are focused on that. I do think having private enterprise involved in healthcare is important for innovation and frankly for competition, right? And frankly for the health of our of our ecosystem, because we have seen health systems be monopolies, nonprofits and for-profit health systems that are owned by doctors or even large physician groups, specialty groups. They are monopolies. And I think having a little bit of competition, which private equity does do, venture-backed capital does do, is good for the system. I frankly think in a lot of areas there are failing health systems, and there needs to be other support. And I think private equity-backed companies can provide offerings. And I do think, generally the trend of venture and private equity investing in physician groups is to move stuff out of the health system when it doesn't need to be there, right? To use ambulatory surgery centers, to use remote patient monitoring, see other types of technology-based delivery modalities to try and improve the quality of care, make better patient experience, and lower the cost. So I don't love this from that perspective, because I'm generally more competition's a good. There are going to be bad outliers. I understand. That's why this law came up, right? But I just don't think it's the right perspective.
Do you think it'll impact startups though? Because most startups use this model.
No, 100%. It's not just private equity. It's like all of these digital health companies, they have to have a PC owner by law to practice, the medicine. A lot of them are MSOs structurally themselves.
Yeah.
So it's not just about private equity and the profit-driven perspective.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't think private equity is necessarily bad, as I just said, but I also think it's about the venture-backed model. Like if this expands beyond Oregon, it's going to be a real hit to innovation, and I think a hit to competition. But no doubt, Hallie, there's we've been talking about, there's just a negative healthcare sentiment in our country right now, right? And I think it's going to be a really interesting couple of years, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, especially when Medicaid's getting cut, commercial exchange funding is going to get cut. There's lower federal funding in healthcare because of the Trump administration slashing its spend. I think, to then sort of take aim at one of the providers of care, which is private equity venture-backed companies, would be totally unwise for our system. It's going to be interesting.
I always, when people ask me about private equity in healthcare, I always say this: there are both for-profit and nonprofit hospitals on the best of lists, and there are both for-profit and nonprofit hospitals on the worst of lists. I don't think that the tax structure necessarily dictates the quality. There's a lot more to it than that. It's not that black and white.
And by the way, look at the salaries of nonprofit health system leaders and compare them to the salaries of our venture-backed or private equity-backed companies. I mean, they are often five-fold. Now, they don't have the equity upside, but it's anyways. All right, final story. This was an interesting one. There was this, in one of our at least my favorite health tech nerds, I know you read it too, there was this post, which was a little arcane, but basically the New England Journal of Medicine, and we'll post in the show notes, had an article which highlighted that a lot of medical schools are actually shortening their preclinical curriculum and eliminating historically what would be called bedrock subject matter classes like histology and pathobiology for med students. And instead, and pathobiology includes topics such as cell injury, death, inflammation, coagulation, like basic things that are important to the practice of medicine and understanding the sort of the pathogenesis of disease. And some schools are rather just incorporating what used to be standalone classes into kind of more organ system type of classes as part of them, and therefore shortening the curriculum for med students. And
by how much? Shortening by months? By taking a year out? Like how much?
I think it's like really shortening the first year of med school, but I don't think it's months. I think it's months, not like a year, right? And so, anyways, these are small changes, and there was a little bit of mostly negative, saying this is a bad thing. It's a little bit of like we walk to school and snow every day type of perspective on Twitter, and health tech nerds saying this is stupid, like this is important. But it got me thinking, like, wow, we're talking about this, and yet AI is going to completely disrupt not only the practice of medicine, but medical school. And by the way, I don't know. I think like a lot of good people probably don't go to med school because it's so freaking long. You got like 4 years of classes, and then you got
and expensive,
right? Expensive. And then you got residency, and then you got fellowship, and like I don't know. Some of my friends are young 30s, mid 30s before they're actually making a salary, and frankly, in charge of their own practice or in charge of actually seeing patients and kind of practicing at the top of their license. And so to me, it's like, why are we having this conversation? Like, you guys should be talking about how we're going to like,
oh my gosh.
And people are like, well, it's algorithmic defined practice of medicine, but you're like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. And instead, Hallie, I know you're, it's like more the humane society side of medicine is like the actual So I'm curious, like what you thought about it. I just thought this was like so nearsighted, but
fascinating. I mean, we should link the Twitter post from the New England Journal of Medicine because I did read through those comments and they were 100% negative.
Right. Well, there's one guy who said M1, like 50% of my M1 classes were a waste of time. There was one person, you're right, and the rest were all negative.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, I think every single industry is going to change in ways that we can't even imagine over the next decade because of AI. And so academia across every discipline needs to really think about how to prepare current students for the future world because academia moves so slowly and AI is moving so fast. Med school particularly, with AI and digital diagnostics, like the question is, what will be the uniquely human part of a physician's job in the future? And how do we train for that today?
Put aside the algorithms.
When these students, people entering right now, when they actually are finished and going to be treating patients, like it's going to look completely different.
Right. Like robots might be doing the surgery. And then to your point, what's the role of the patient? It's sort of more, the human experience is my guess. Right. So anyways, I just found it so interesting. We're kind of having the wrong discussion in that New England Journal of Medicine piece and then the follow-up on Twitter. So. Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad they're doing some introspective thinking at med schools because the change is going to happen whether they like it or not, and it's important. But people dedicate their entire lives to a profession, and you and I both have friends that went through med school, and it seems awful. It's long and grueling, and then residency, you're overworked and underpaid, and it's overdue for a wholesale transformation. So.
Yeah. For those who are interested in the topic, obviously you can listen. We've talked to a bunch of CEOs, Shiv Rao of Abridge. We had Eric Larson on, which was an awesome podcast on AI and how it's going to affect healthcare. And then coming up in a few weeks, Brian Anderson, who's the head of the Coalition for Health AI and really focused on the safety. But we also talk about this topic of how AI is going to change healthcare. So encourage our listeners to tune into those.
And go to heartofhealthcarepodcast.com and you can actually go to episodes and search by category. We have an AI category, so you can see all of the folks, the great folks that we've had on. The AI episodes do really well. So
it turns out people
we're gonna do more of them. Everybody's interested in that topic.
All right. Well, that was a lot for this month. Fun times. Hope your you have a great summer, Hallie.
Yeah, you too. Well, I'll see you in August.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe. The Heart of Healthcare is produced by Hallie Tecco and hosted by Michael Esquivel, Steve Krause, and Hallie Tecco. The show is engineered, edited, and mixed by Kyle Moore. Visit our website, heartofhealthcarepodcast.com, for show notes and details.